Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the MFA. My name is Ronnie Baer, and I am the Senior Curator of European Paintings here. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor H. Perry Chapman, who received her BA in Art History from Swarthmore College and her PhD from Princeton University. A specialist in 17th century Dutch art, she's published widely on Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Jan Steen, on self-portraiture, and on 17th century art theory and artists' biographies. Her seminal book, Rembrandt Self-Portraits, A Study in 17th Century Identity, examines Rembrandt's representations of himself against the background of early modern notions of individuality. Professor Chapman was co-curator and co-catalog author for the major exhibition, Jan Steen, Painter and Storyteller, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Rijksmuseum, Amsterdam. Her current area of interest and research is the artist's studio, which has led to articles on the Rembrandt House as Portrait of an Artist, the imagined studios of Rembrandt and Vermeer, Cornelis Kettel, finger painter and poet painter, and the wooden body representing the mannequin in Dutch artists' studios. Her research has been supported by fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Center of Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Professor Chapman served as editor-in-chief of the Art Bulletin from 2000 to 2004, and she is currently chair of the editorial board of the Nederlands Kunsthistorisch Jaarboek, or the Netherlands Yearbook for the History of Art. You're in for a huge treat tonight. Please welcome my friend Perry Chapman.
Ronnie, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming. And above all, Ronnie, thank you for this wonderful exhibition. And if you haven't seen it, I hope you all have seen the exhibition. If not, you've got to see it tonight. My favorite room of the exhibition is not that sumptuous, fabulous first room, but the last room, the one called Where the Classes Meet. And my favorite painting, I think, in the exhibition is this river landscape with a ferry boat by Solomon van Ruysdael that's in that room, because it demonstrates just how conscious of rank and status, of their God-given place in life, the Dutch were in the 17th century. But it also shows how routine it must have been for the classes to come together. The Netherlands, or lowlands, is filled with rivers to cross and canals for transport. Here, a river ferry is packed with people and animals of all types. Our eyes are drawn first to the aristocratic couple wearing red and on white horses. Note the woman's face is protected by a black mask. Beside them is a beggar man, also on horseback. A cowherd accompanies his 2 cows. On board are 6 dogs. They too are of different classes. At left, here are 2 elegant, fine dogs. Here are 2 dogs who are hitched to this, what must be a little cart or sledge with its porter. And here is the ruffian dog, but behind him there's another dog. He's growling at the cows. Pictures like this one bring to mind the period's canal boat chats, political pamphlets, and dialogue in which people of different ranks discuss a pressing issue of the day. The classes also met in artist studios. In Amsterdam's open market, high-end painters worked in and sold paintings from their homes. They also thrived on a culture of visiting studios, which is exemplified in this painting in this painting by Peter Kade, by three finely dressed gentlemen who have come to look and perhaps to buy, modeling the behavior of collector connoisseurs, or in the period's term, liefhebbers, literally art lovers. The two at left scrutinize framed, finished pictures, while the third leans on the artist's chair to examine the painting in progress. In the middle is the painter, looking appropriately deferential. Painters belonged to what was called the broad middle class. They worked with their hands and so ranked among those who practiced trades or professions, and they were members of guilds. Yet they ranked above other craftsmen, such as tailors, who you see in this marvelous painting from the exhibition. As producers of luxury goods with intellectual cachet, they hobnobbed with the educated elite, and they themselves were sometimes well educated. Indeed, by this time, painting ranked not as a manual craft, but as an art, as one of the liberal arts. Painters, broadly speaking, like to think of themselves as creating with their minds, not just their hands. In the MFA's Artist in His Studio, the young Rembrandt, and I think that's who the artist is here, wears not contemporary clothes like the painter on the left, but a fanciful and fancy long robe with sashed robe. No visitors bother this painter, and over the course of his career, Rembrandt would repeatedly alienate or displease his clients. Instead, here he is alone in his studio with the door closed. Here's the closed door. Let's look more closely. This artist needs solitude to create, to do the think work of painting. Working alone was associated with creative genius, and its mystique goes back at least to Vasari's biography of Michelangelo. I'm sure it goes further back. However, the reality was that throughout his career, Rembrandt worked with a range of pupils and assistants. Here, the panel on his easel has the broad shape and large size of a history painting, that is, of a biblical, mythological, or historical subject, then considered to be the most important kind of painting. The light that shines on the easel and is reflected off just the edge suggests that this artist is inspired. From the outset, Rembrandt had grand ambitions and a sense of his exceptional capabilities. When it comes to class, artists, and Rembrandt especially, present an unusual case. I framed tonight's lecture as Rembrandt, social climber or outcast, to convey the complicated and nuanced nature of Rembrandt's social standing. Here is an area where the experts don't agree. Some scholars have seen him as a social climber. I tend to think that he sets himself apart from his society enough that it is difficult to judge him by his society's standards. He often represents himself as somewhat of an outsider, and we see a progression of increasingly greater indifference towards social norms. And through that indifference, he crafts an idea of the artist who gains stature through his work, his artistic knowledge, and his professional autonomy. Who Rembrandt became as a painter was partly the outcome of his extraordinary talent and inner drive, but his circumstances also played a part. Like many Dutch artists, he came from a solid middle-class background. His father owned a mill and some property in Leiden. His family had enough money to send him to the local elite Latin school, which prepared students to go on to Leiden's University. Although Rembrandt registered at the university, he did not attend. Instead, his parents, recognizing his talent, sent him on the relatively expensive course of becoming a painter. First, he apprenticed with a Leiden painter. Then, in 1624-25, at about age 18 or 19, he went for a 6-month finishing up apprenticeship with Peter Lastman, the most important history painter in Amsterdam. As you can see from this comparison, which I won't go into, but I'll have you look, Rembrandt learned a great deal about staging a historical narrative from Lastmann. Rembrandt then returned to Leiden, where he set up as an independent master and developed a local clientele. A formative moment of Rembrandt's early career was the visit from the distinguished, influential Constantine Hauchens, whose portrait by Thomas de Keyser is in the exhibition. A man of burgher origins who aspired to nobility, Hauchens epitomizes the complications and nuances of class in the Dutch Republic. He was secretary to this man, the stadtholder Frederick Hendrik, the nominal ruler of the Dutch Republic, shown here in this marvelous portrait by Van Dyck, also in the exhibition. As secretary, and the term comes from the word secret, keeper of the secrets, Hauchens was the stadtholder's close advisor as well as his art agent. This portrait crafts Hauchens as a universal man. Note the pair of globes, usually a heavenly and an earthly globe, who is a musician and writer and also an architect, but who also attends to urgent court matters. His clerk ensures the speedy delivery of important correspondence. Scouting for talent in 1629, Hauchens visited the Leiden studios, or maybe shared studio, of the young Rembrandt and his younger colleague Jan Lievens. In his autobiography, Hauchens praised this painting by Rembrandt, which shows Judas returning the 30 pieces of silver to the high priests after he had betrayed Christ. Hauchens writes, and you'll see with some exaggeration, "Compare this painting with all Italy, indeed with all the wondrous beauties that have survived from the most ancient of days." By the way, no paintings survive from ancient days. He goes on, "The gesture of that one despairing Judas, screaming, begging for forgiveness, his gaze wild, his hair torn out by the roots, his garments rent, his arms contorted, his hands clenched until they bleed, his whole body writhing in piteous hideousness." This Judas, I think you see more from this what Hauchens values, which is drama and intense emotional expression. Hauchens was so impressed with what he saw in Leiden that he must have had Rembrandt and Lievens compete for a commission from the stadtholder. Rembrandt won based, I think, on his ability to represent a biblical figure with dramatic and convincing emotion. The deeply expressive, moving descent from the cross is one of the resulting panels of the series of Christ's Passion that Rembrandt painted over the course of the 1630s. Also in Leiden, Rembrandt began to make self-portraits. Over the course of his career, Rembrandt painted, etched, and drew more self-portraits than anyone up until the 20th century. At just this time, early on, Hauchens was writing his autobiography, so perhaps he had an impact on Rembrandt's early interest in self-portrayal. In these, you see Rembrandt experimenting with conveying his psychological and emotional presence. In the painting on the left, he shades his eyes to evoke his inner self and perhaps to suggest his melancholic temperament. For the etched self-portrait Surprised, we have to imagine him making faces in a mirror in order to practice the expression of wonder or astonishment that he would then use in a biblical painting, in fact, in the Raising of Lazarus. Rembrandt would have been aware of Horace's advice to the tragic actor: "If you wish me to cry, you must first feel grief yourself." The self-portrait as a beggar may, too, advertise Rembrandt's ability to put himself in the place of, feel the pain of, the figures he paints or etches. His role as beggar may also comment on the outsider status of painters broadly. And then again, through these innovative, strikingly informal self-portraits, Rembrandt was surely making claims about his own unconventionality. At the same time, he was painting more formal yet completely imaginary self-portraits. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the self-portrait of 1629 from the Gardner Museum on the left. The one on the right, which is now in Liverpool, dates to about 1630, and remarkably, by 1632, it, or one just like it, was in the collection of Charles I of England. That Rembrandt's fame had spread so early to the English court must have been the doing of Constantine Howkins. In both of these, Rembrandt wears not contemporary attire, but fanciful quasi-historical clothing, a beret, and a gold chain through which he fashions himself as a noble artist. And I put noble in quotation marks because it really is an imaginary claim. His fanciful chain only evokes the gold chains of honor that court artists received from their ruler patrons. Rembrandt would never have such a patron who granted chains and never get such a chain. After these fanciful and casual self-portraits, this one of 1632 comes as a surprise. It is one of the very few self-portraits in which Rembrandt painted himself in contemporary attire. Like Howkins, he wears a fine hat of imported beaver felt and a soft, rough collar of the sort then in style. With this assertive image, Rembrandt marked his newfound success as a portraitist, for he portrays himself as he would one of his well-to-do sitters. He may look like his clients here, but he was not of their class and never would be. In 1633, he moved to Amsterdam, where because he was not yet a citizen, he went to work for the painter-dealer Hendrik Eilenberg, cranking out portraits, running Eilenberg's workshop, and lodging in Eilenberg's house. The art historian Gary Schwartz has said that Rembrandt's move to Amsterdam signaled the failure of his quest to become a court painter. More likely, Rembrandt recognized that wealthy, bustling, international Amsterdam offered him greater potential and greater independence. Also, to say that this self-portrait shows Rembrandt's social aspirations misses its real ambition. Here you can see the genesis of Rembrandt's image from an engraving after a self-portrait by the famous Peter Paul Rubens, who wears, you can just see it at his neckline, a few links of a chain, wears a chain that he'd actually been given by a noble patron. Rubens, from the Catholic southern Netherlands, worked for princely patrons at courts throughout Europe and was the consummate gentleman artist. Rembrandt first modeled himself, or his image, after Rubens on paper. Then in paint, he transformed Rubens' courtly persona into a burgherish image better suited to his circumstances in the Protestant Dutch Republic. He is striving, but for artistic stature rather than the probably to him shallow goal of social status. 3 large and expensive commissioned portraits in the exhibition's middle-class room, or more accurately, the room called Professions and Trades, provide a sense of the impact Rembrandt had in his first few years in Amsterdam. This extraordinary portrait of the wealthy master shipbuilder Jan Rijksen and his wife Griet Jans must have seemed absolutely original for the way it puts husband and wife into action, working in tandem as a couple. Their pride in work speaks to the values of the merchant class, although many merchants aspiring to nobility or at least upper-class heirs would prefer portraits that concealed their professions. More conventional, but just as lively, is this pair of grand, full-length portraits of Johannes Ellison, the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church in Norwich, England, and his wife, Maria Boccanola. Again, Ellison's profession and faith are conveyed through his gesture and his room full of books. Compared to these two stunning examples of loving married couples, Rembrandt's portrait of himself with his wife Saskia is quite a shocker, and it must have been to their contemporaries. In 1633, Rembrandt married Saskia van Eilenberg, the orphaned daughter of a burgomaster of Leeuwarden and a cousin of Hendrik Eilenberg, that painter-dealer for whom Rembrandt had first worked. Rembrandt has painted himself with Saskia sitting on his lap in a tavern. He smiles and raises his tall beer glass as Saskia turns back to look at us. We know it's a tavern because of the tally board up here. The painting has been interpreted as Rembrandt and Saskia flaunting their newfound wealth in the face of their supposedly staid society, or in response to accusations from Saskia's family that they were squandering her inheritance. Alternatively, their extravagant behavior, sumptuous old-fashioned theatrical costume, and the peacock pie on the table have been taken as comments on worldly excess and vanity. Most likely, this is a historicized portrait in which Rembrandt plays the role of the biblical prodigal son, squandering his patrimony in a tavern, in which case Rembrandt's helpmate has become his whore. We have no record of how Rembrandt's contemporaries felt about his casting his wife in such an unflattering guise. This print shows why Rembrandt's contemporaries would have understood his painting as the prodigal son. Outdoor merry companies were associated not just with love gardens and with love, but also specifically with the parable. Note in the foreground, a couple, one sitting on the other's lap, another one. Lap sitting was always suggestive of improper behavior. In the background, you get another part of the story where the prodigal is driven from the tavern. Note, there's this, I don't think this is a peacock pie, but there is a pie, and here are peacocks for vanity. Especially in Calvinist Holland, the sinful prodigal's return home and acceptance by his father was taken as a metaphor for God's grace and loving acceptance of all sinners. This is Peter Paul Rubens's elegant portrait of himself and his wife, wearing the height of fashion and in the honeysuckle bower of a love garden, which I'm sure was not associated with the prodigal son and prodigality. Of course, Rembrandt had never seen this painting, but let's imagine that he had heard about it. Rembrandt knew people, Constantine Howkins for one, who knew Rubens. Only if you'd been a guest in Rubens's house could you say you'd seen the picture. News must have traveled. In response to Rubens's conjugal love garden, Rembrandt defiantly goes him one better and evokes a different kind of love, the erotic love that ignites passion and moves the artist to heights of creativity. It's a transgression in biblical guise, in which Saskia is complicit. Did he aim to shock or to comment on the proverbial misbehavior of artists, or to allude in a crass and down-to-earth way to the theoretical notion that love was the artist's highest goal and inspiration? In the face of Rubens's idealism, Rembrandt wanted to make his art boldly real and highly emotional. Rubens's Prometheus Bound was in The Hague for a time where the young Rembrandt likely saw it. In response to Rubens's mythology, Rembrandt painted a gory Old Testament scene, the blinding of Samson. He transforms a heroic nude whose liver is perpetually devoured by the eagle into the dramatic immediacy of the gouging of an eye and making it look as excruciating as possible. This kind of emulation, in which one refers recognizably to and attempts to surpass an earlier work of art, was reserved for the best masters who aimed to achieve dissimilar similarity by appropriately changing the subject. Rembrandt's intense pictorial rivalry with Rubens during the 1630s was tied up with his relations with Constantine Haukens and the court, where Rubens was favored. On the left, at the very far left, is Constantine Haukens' new house in The Hague on choice land given to him by the stadtholder. It was probably with this location in mind that Rembrandt tried to give the blinding of Samson to Haukens, who refused it. Why Haukens didn't want the painting remains unclear. Perhaps it strayed too far from Rubens's classicism, or perhaps Haukens and Rembrandt had had a falling out. After all, Rembrandt still had not delivered all the panels of the Passion series. Haukens designed his house himself with the help of the leading classicist architect, Jacob van Campen. And I mention van Campen, here's another view of Haukens' house, because it is likely that he was the architect who had classicized, by adding a pediment, the house on Amsterdam's Breestraat that Rembrandt purchased in 1639. That it had already been classicized by the time Rembrandt bought it. And this was actually the first classical pediment in Amsterdam, apparently. Because it was the house was large and expensive for an artist in Amsterdam, some critics have seen it as evidence of Rembrandt's social climbing or overreach. Yet that view is complicated by several things. The house was in a neighborhood that was declining in value and that by the end of the century would be Amsterdam's Jewish quarter. It was also in the artist district, where Rembrandt had studied with Peter Lastmann and where he had worked for Hendrik Eilenberg, actually on the very same street. 2, a grand house may have been what Rembrandt thought he needed to convey his artistic stature. He would have known about famous artists' houses, especially probably that of Rubens in Antwerp, which you see here in a later 17th century engraving. By Rembrandt's time, the notion of the artist's house as a site of discourse and display, and a place that embodied the artist, his knowledge, and his professional identity was well established. In the urban merchant culture of Amsterdam, having a house that at once spoke to the prestige of his profession and fostered his artistic innovation contributed to Rembrandt's artistic autonomy. Today, the house is a historic house museum with a modern annex for special exhibitions. And if you have a chance to get to Amsterdam, do not miss the Rembrandt house. Thanks to the room-by-room inventory of Rembrandt's possessions made in 1656, and to some of Rembrandt's drawings, the house has been reconstructed to look much as it would have in Rembrandt's time. This built-in cupboard bed has been reconstructed on the basis of Rembrandt's drawing of Saskia in bed. Rembrandt was a collector and probably a dealer who owned over 200 paintings by a range of painters, and the museum has hung the walls of the house with comparable works. This is the entrance hall, or voorhouse. Rembrandt had practical reasons for buying a large house. He needed the space to accommodate his hopefully growing family, for his busy studio, and for his assistants and students. He gave the whole top floor to the students. He, at one point, had so many students he had to rent extra space for them. Also, Rembrandt would have received clients in the house, for he would have sold most of his work from his home. Because Rembrandt's early biographers reported that he was, shall we say, not exactly welcoming to visitors, it has been assumed that he did not receive many. According to Filippo Baldinucci, Rembrandt was a most temperamental man who despised everyone, and when he worked, would not have granted an audience to the first monarch in the world. Yet Baldinucci goes on to say that this monarch would have had to return again and again until he found Rembrandt no longer busy, implying perhaps that Rembrandt objected less to the visitor than to letting the visitor watch and interrupt him while painting. That's one of the big questions about studio visits, is how many people actually got to watch the painter paint. Most likely, many people, Liefhebbers, those art lovers, maybe crass naamkoopers, meaning name buyers, people who only bought paintings for the name of the artist. Sitters for portraits, parents arranging instructions for their sons, other artists, all these people would have had occasion to come to Rembrandt's house. I wouldn't suggest that these people came all at once. Most likely, though, they would have come individually to pose and to have their faces painted. We know some of the most amazing things about Rembrandt. For example, that he enlarged the wooden gallery attached to the back of the house in order to paint this large militia company portrait known as the Night Watch. This elegant, full-length portrait from the exhibition shows Andries de Graaf, a member of Amsterdam's powerful ruling regent class and 7 times one of the city's burgomasters. Presumably, even a sitter of this stature would have come to Rembrandt's studio, perhaps, though, for a very limited sitting. The portrait, which draws on formula for painting the nobility, showing de Graaf's aspirations, is dated 1639, so it's likely that Rembrandt painted it in his new house. Rembrandt may initially have thought a house at the cutting edge of architectural fashion would enhance his appeal to Howkins and the court, as well as to well-to-do Amsterdammers such as this. However, these sources of commission dried up almost immediately. Rembrandt would paint only 2 more pictures for the stadtholder, and after this portrait, he would paint no more portraits of Amsterdam regents and few commissioned portraits for the rest of the 1640s. He resumed painting portraits in earnest in the 1650s when he needed money. Up for debate is whether Rembrandt lost patronage he would have wanted because he alienated this clientele. He had a dispute with de Graaf over this painting, or because his style was increasingly out of sync with the trend for lighter, more refined classicism. Or it may have been that Rembrandt was sufficiently independent that he chose to pursue other kinds of clients and to turn to painting religious subjects and to etching and drawing landscapes and from life in the studio because that is what interested him. This self-portrait at the age of 34, dated 1640, epitomizes the virtuoso guise that Rembrandt invented for himself. Instead of portraying himself like his elite sitters in fashionable contemporary dress, he wears a fanciful version of a painter's beret, an elegant antique, was their word, or historical clothing. In the previous year, he had etched his self-portrait leaning on a stone sill with fictional long hair and in similar fanciful guise. With both of these, he distances himself from his contemporary society and from more ordinary Dutch painters by historicizing his image and by alluding to past masters. Specifically, Rembrandt modeled his image after 2 Italian portraits that had just been sold in Amsterdam. Raphael's portrait of the author of the influential book of the Courtier, Baldassare Castiglione, and Titian's portrait of a man, which was then thought to represent the poet Ariosto. In evoking these portraits of famous men by famous painters, Rembrandt engaged in an act of emulation through which he likened painting to poetry and staked his claim to a place in the lineage of great painters. In so doing, he also claimed the kind of artistic knowledge that was necessary to the virtuous painter. And I should add, all of his students and a number of his contemporaries then immediately imitated him in using this portrait type. In the Rembrandt House Museum, the second floor is entirely devoted to Rembrandt's artistic production in two rooms, the Schilderkammer, or studio, and the most astonishing room of all, the Kunstkammer, or art chamber. This was, in effect, Rembrandt's private museum. It embodied his knowledge. Kunstkammer was the term both for an encyclopedic collection of naturalia and man-made antiquities, art, and exotica, and for the space that housed it. Such collections derived from 16th century princely cabinets of curiosity, which aimed to categorize and display the full range of universal human knowledge. Although many Dutch painters collected, Rembrandt stood out for the extent of his collection and especially for his Kunstkammer. The 1656 inventory of Rembrandt's possessions details its contents, which is why the museum can reconstruct it. It contained a pair of globes, a wide range of artificial things, or man-made things, including East Indian boxes and pots, glass from Venice, musical instruments from all over, arms and armor, a Japanese helmet. A small cabinet contained coins and medals. Rembrandt's natural wonders included a drawer of minerals, 23 specimens of land and sea creatures, and on the backmost shelf, a large quantity of horns and marine plants. And there were other things too. The sculptures in the Kunstkammer included a pissing little child, like the mannequin piece in Brussels, and two completely nude figures, along with busts of Socrates, Homer, Aristotle, and 13 Roman emperors, and these last were inventoried and presumably arranged in chronological order, evidence of Rembrandt's knowledge. The Kunstkammer also housed nearly 70 Kunstbücher, or art books or folios. And you see some of these folios, not the original ones, but similar folios here. In these, Rembrandt kept his remarkable collection of several thousand prints and drawings, his paper art. These included a book of drawings by the greatest masters of the whole world, the precious book of Andrea Mantegna, and albums dedicated to prints by Raphael, Titian, Lucas van Leyden, Peter Bruegel, Lucas Cranach, to name just a few. The contents of these Kunstbücher amounted to what was then the history of art. As a youth, Rembrandt had told Constantine Huygens that he could see what he needed of Italian art in Amsterdam, and that's why he never went to Italy. By 1656, Rembrandt could see a lot that he needed in his own house. These are 2 pages from the inventory where the follow the art books, the Kunstbücher. Rembrandt's amassing of a sizable collection, like his purchase of an expensive house, has been seen as evidence of social climbing and intellectual striving as intended to impress. But knowledge of earlier art, of history, of the natural world, was the currency of intellectual and artistic stature. It's important to understand the collection as essential to Rembrandt's project of self-making, to his mystique, to his idea of himself, to his very being. Just as his self-portraits were intended for a broader audience, but also for himself, so too was the collection for public consumption and for personal use and satisfaction. Above all, Rembrandt's collection was critical to inspiring his creativity. He made inventive use of objects from his collection in an astonishing range of ways, from paintings that represented classical sculpture to drawing after Leonardo's famous Last Supper, which of course he knew only through engravings, to making etchings, etchings that pointedly reworked famous prints, the Virgin and Child with the cat and the snake, turns Mantegna's Madonna and Child into a domestic Holy Family with Joseph in the window. To an instance in which he etched one rare shell from life. More broadly, the Kunstkammer was a special place reserved for the practice of connoisseurship and curiosity. A kind of scholar-artist study, it was an extension of the studio. The inventory tells us that there was an antechamber to the Kunstkammer that was furnished with 4 chairs and a pine table. We can imagine that Rembrandt sat here alone to study objects from his collection and perhaps to draw them, but looking at and discussing art and natural specimens, nascent connoisseurship and scientific inquiry were also collective endeavors. This may too have been the place for academy-like art theoretical discourse. Students would have joined Rembrandt in the Kunstkammer, as would a range of like-minded friends, colleagues, and Liefhebbers. This is Rembrandt's friend, the middling apothecary and print collector Abraham Franzen, probably studying a print, perhaps in his own collection. And this shows open one of these albums there where you keep prints and drawings in between the pages. Visitors to the Kunstkammer might have included even the wealthy, phenomenally distinguished Jan Six, here in an etching of 1647 that evokes his introspection and intellect, at least until Rembrandt had a falling out with Jan Six. According to an early biographer, in the autumn of his life, Rembrandt kept company with common people and such as practiced art, and that wasn't said in a complimentary way. Increasingly, I think he distanced himself from fancy people like Jan Six and did spend his time with fellow artists and intellectuals. In this self-portrait etching by a window of 1648, Rembrandt presents an image of himself that is unlike what we've seen before. He sits at a table, drawing on a prepared copper plate that rests on folded cloth, which is on top of a book. Presumably, he's looking in a mirror and making this very self-portrait. The directness of this portrait, its sketchy etching style and velvety dry point, and its claim to be made from life are completely different from the imaginary antique guise of his earlier self-portraits. As in many of his late painted self-portraits, Rembrandt shows himself in working attire and at work. His sense of self, of who he is, depends less on likening himself to past masters and more on the identity and autonomy he gains from his craft and his studio. His adoption of this working artist guise may also have to do with his increasingly complicated life circumstances and his increasing indifference to societal norms. Saskia had died in 1642. The conditions of her will prevented Rembrandt from remarrying without losing what he inherited from her. It was important. Rembrandt first took up with their son Titus's nursemaid, Gertke Dirks, but by 1648, the date of this portrait, Gertke had sued him for breach of promise of marriage. The result was an ugly interlude in which Gertke ended up in the spin house, or the House of Corrections. The reason, not for her ending up in the spin house, but the reason for him losing interest in her was that his affections had shifted to his housekeeper, Hendrike Stoffels. And this drawing of a model in Rembrandt's studio may represent Hendrike. That's a debate I don't have time to get into. Who, when she was pregnant in the early 1650s, was summoned to appear before the church council for having acted like a harlot with Rembrandt the painter. They had to summon her twice. They didn't summon him because he didn't belong to the church. That was not unusual to not belong to the church, by the way. Modeling in the nude, if indeed Hendricka did so, would also have been acting like a harlot, for models were usually prostitutes. Here he is again, looking wonderfully defiant in working attire and painted with his signature loose painterly style with its visible brushwork. Rembrandt's disregard for his society's norms extended to his financial behavior. As much as the house and collection sustained him professionally, they also contributed to his financial ruin. He had bought the house with a substantial loan that he was never able to pay off, despite his substantial earnings as a painter and teacher. In the early 1650s, Rembrandt's financial situation had turned grim. In January 1653, the mortgage holder demanded to be paid, and Rembrandt had not made any payments in 4 years. To raise money, Rembrandt resorted to drastic, unethical, ineffective measures, and also his work appears to have been disrupted when his next-door neighbor, Daniel Pinto, a trader in tobacco and other New World goods, needed to shore up the sinking foundations of his house. And since Rembrandt's was adjoined, he wanted Rembrandt to help pay. It was also disruptive because replacing the pilings is a very noisy, disruptive thing. But above all, Rembrandt had recklessly and ostentatiously spent vast sums filling his house with the over 200 paintings, nearly 60 sculptures, both marbles and plaster casts, thousands of prints and drawings, and countless erudite or curiosities. Rembrandt's insatiable quest for art and financial recklessness led to his bankruptcy. What I have not yet told you, but which perhaps you already know, is that the inventory of 1656, which allows the Rembrandt House Museum to fashion Rembrandt as a successful painter in a grand house, was drawn up by an official from the Amsterdam Chamber of Insolvent Estates with Rembrandt's help at the time of his bankruptcy for the purpose of disposing of his worldly goods in order to protect him from his creditors and probably from the possibility of going to debtor's prison. Rembrandt painted the princely self-portrait in the Frick collection in 1658, the year that he was forced to sell his house. It's a magnificent Venice-inspired fiction and fabulous color. The terms of the bankruptcy also required Rembrandt to relinquish control of his business to his son Titus and common-law wife Hendricka. We can only speculate, and people tend to, as to whether this financial crisis and loss of his home was humiliating for Rembrandt or whether he saw it as a relief. Does he compensate by conveying his mastery as enthroned majesty? Yet if mortgage and money problems tied his hands, Rembrandt's collecting habits spurred his creativity, served his profound intellectual and artistic aspirations, and ultimately liberated him to pursue his passion for art and to paint, etch, and draw what he wanted. In the face of bankruptcy, Rembrandt kept his home and collection intact as long as he could. When he was forced in 1658 to part with his paper art, the handbill that advertised the sale of drawings, spoke of drawings and sketches by Rembrandt and works of art by various famous Italian, French, German, and Netherlandish masters, which the said Rembrandt van Rijn has assembled with a great curiosity. This great curiosity had driven and distinguished Rembrandt. It would also prompt him to begin collecting anew once he had moved in 1660 to a smaller rented house on the Rosenkracht in the modest Jordan, which, with its proximity to the newly developed ring canals and their stately homes, was becoming Amsterdam's new artist neighborhood. There, his artistic self-esteem and independence intact, he would paint some of his greatest works. One of these is the marvelous self-portrait in Kenwood House outside of London, through which Rembrandt conveys his universality. You've seen pairs of globes before. On the back wall are the two circles of a wall map that represent, I think, two spheres of either the world or heavenly and worldly spheres. His palette and brushes, the sliver of the edge of the painting on his easel. Remember in the MFA's painting, you see the light hitting the edge of the panel. And his visible, rough, painterly brushwork together claim that his stature and dignity come from his work and his identity as a painter. Thank you.